Hello, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ed Hope, a junior doctor in the UK. And today I'm going to be breaking down some scenes from Casualty, the UK TV hospital drama. I'm going to be looking at their episode focusing on COVID-19, so the first few weeks of the pandemic, and given it's set in the emergency department in the UK and that's where I'm working, I thought I'd be able to share a little bit more about what's happening on the screen and share some of my insights too. This episode has been really well received in the medical community, so let's check it out. So straight off the bat here, you may think all this tape here and all these warning signs is a bit of a dramatization, like something you might see in a zombie movie, but this is exactly what areas of the hospital are like, to try and delineate areas that are likely to be high risk for COVID-19 so no one accidentally goes into them.
I think it's time to set up the hot zone. Anyone with a respiratory illness, fever, then we have a separate team, separate entrances, and we isolate from the rest of the hospital.
So a little message here from Dr. Connie, one of the consultants in the emergency department, saying the need to change the whole flow of the hospital, which very much happened. I think it does kind of underappreciate the amount of people that are going to be involved in making that decision. So there's going to be lots of hospital managers and leaders from various teams, not just one consultant doctor, but obviously they're going to be very involved as well. And they talk about the hot zone here. We called it the red zone in the emergency department where I work. Very clear that patients with COVID-19 are going to have to be treated in areas away from other patients. But don't forget, lots of people with COVID-19 can be asymptomatic, so people may come in with other things. So therefore, every patient that comes into hospital needed to have a test. In the meantime, they'd be on what we call an amber ward, waiting for their test result, which usually took around 24 hours before then going to a green area or indeed going to one of the red areas. The introduction of the rapid testing, so the lateral flow testing, sped this process up.
What do you make of this PPE situation? I mean, are we being exposed here?
I think as long as we learn to wash our hands and sneeze into our elbows like civilised people, we should be okay.
Really interesting point here. This was very much the attitude early on, that just making sure we're even more meticulous than usual. Everyone here without even just surgical masks, and we know the benefit of them. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Well, now, you may well laugh, but I'm not taking any chances. I got myself one of these online.
So staff wearing their own PPE, particularly these respirator masks you see here, yeah, there was a handful of people that were doing this, including myself. I ended up getting one of these respirator masks online. So I wore this at the bedside when I went to see patients with COVID-19, because actually the guidelines were just a simple medical mask, and I just thought it was better to take more precaution. Although, as in this scene, was met with a little bit of sneering and laughter amongst other people. But, you know, these masks are exactly the same as the FFP respirator masks, the disposable ones you see. They just look a little bit more extravagant.
I'm not going in there, I'll get infected.
I haven't heard of any cases in the hospital yet.
People have it with no symptoms that I heard. You could be giving it to me right now.
Patients scared, not wanting to go into hospital here. I saw lots of people that were kind of paralysed with fear of, you know, contracting the virus when in hospital, and no doubt this would have happened to some people despite all the changes we talked about in terms of the patient flow and trying to keep people who had the virus away from people that hadn't. You know, the hospital is where you go when you're ill, so both of those sets of people are going to be within the same building. And also this did have an impact, I feel, on people when they came into hospital. So we saw people coming in a lot later than they normally would. So people that have had heart attacks, strokes, serious infections, things that are treatable, but they delayed because of their worry of coming into hospital, and that would have had a worse outcome.
Got a friend in control, he's got a couch I could sleep on.
Wait, are you actually going to be moving out?
So I can personally relate to this, people moving out their family home. So I was living with my parents at the beginning of the pandemic, and they're shielding. So to stop me bringing the virus back, I was kindly offered a place at one of my colleagues. But luckily for me, it wasn't on a couch, had my own room, a little ensuite. So in a way, it was a massive upgrade. But I know many of my colleagues as well didn't have this luxury, and they were perhaps carers for the people at home. So they had to be extremely meticulous in their routine, and also even at home trying to distance as much as possible from the other people they live with.
I'm glad you're here, actually. I think I need to go home and self-isolate.
You're not showing symptoms, are you?
No. I'm asthmatic. It's mostly mild, but...
Yeah, so as we see here, this paramedic is unable to be on the front lines. So there was a change in personnel within the emergency department. So many of the people I work with normally, some of them weren't allowed in the red zone now, so only allowed to work in the green zone, and others weren't allowed to work in the emergency department at all, given their underlying medical problems. Even if, as we see here, they were very well controlled.
I'm just looking at this patient's chest x-ray. He was admitted with breathing difficulties and a temperature. He was at the races last weekend.
Along with thousands of other people.
Exactly.
So I think every doctor who's seen a chest x-ray like that will remember that moment, because it's not a typical chest x-ray you're used to. So these bilateral inflammatory changes here, what we call a pneumonitis, is all kind of fluid from the body's inflammatory reaction to the virus. Chest x-rays like this would have existed before COVID-19 from other inflammatory processes, but it's just very unusual to see that. A very chilling moment that this had arrived. Although worth noting here, the x-ray is actually back to front, so the heart shadow should be on the left-hand side, unless the patient has dextrocardia, so the heart on the right-hand side. Not impossible, but very unlikely. And I like the way too, they've kind of put two fingers up to the government here.
He was at the races last weekend.
Along with thousands of other people.
So if you remember back just before we went into lockdown, the Cheltenham Festival went ahead, so a big horse racing event that, looking back, really shouldn't have happened.
Where's the patient now?
He's just here.
That is heartbreaking to watch, actually. Luckily, in my hospital, we had cases later compared to the rest of the UK, and we were able to isolate patients when they first come in and only go into the room with correct PPE. But having said that, I'm pretty sure that some people, perhaps who are asymptomatic that came in, would have exposed people.
No. Call domestics. We have a suspected COVID patient. We need to deep clean the area now.
Okay, they need to deep clean the area, absolutely right. All those particles would have been thrown up in the air and then be laying on surfaces around the patient. And I just want to give a huge shout out to all the domestic staff, so the staff that clean the hospitals. Their workload went through the roof and they rose to the challenge massively. I like in these background shots here all the drawings from children out in the community, and yeah, they filtered into the hospital. That's realistic. So not just on the wards, but also in the atrium in my hospital, we had these huge windows just plastered with rainbows and messages of support, and it really helped at a difficult time feel connected with all the support we were getting outside.
Had a number of false alarms with SARS-CoV-2. One antihistamine later and I'm back on my bike.
Yeah, I remember now. You're a big cycling fan.
And we meet a young chap who's come in breathless. Presumably he's got COVID-19. And one thing I want to pick up on here is the PPE that the doctor's wearing here. Now, you probably think that's what we wear in the emergency department: the respirator mask, the eye protection, a full-length gown, plastic apron and gloves. But no, that's not what we're wearing. So the guideline in the emergency department has been the same the whole way through, and this is whether we see patients with COVID or not, and that's to wear a medical mask, so not the respirator mask we see here, eye protection, plastic apron, so not a full-length gown, and gloves too. And this is still very controversial because there is evidence to suggest that COVID-19 can be spread via aerosolize, so smaller particles that these medical masks won't be able to do anything about. So that's why, people like myself have been wearing our own respirator masks. This extra level of PPE that we see the chap wearing here, that's really only to be used in areas where there's aerosol generating procedures happening. Things like CPR, ventilation, that will be throwing up the secretions from people's throat into the air. Clearly that's why you need extra levels of protection. So in all the media coverage, you probably see people dressed like this, and that's because they're probably filming from ICU where people are on ventilators, or on the medical wards where people are on non-invasive ventilation. Having said that, there may be a few reasons why this may be accurate, this doctor having this highest level of PPE. The first one being that a lot of hospital trusts actually went above and beyond the guidelines, so issued higher level of PPE to their staff. Staff might buy their own masks like I did with the respirator mask, and also the layout of the area may mean that everyone would have to have this higher level of PPE. So for example, in Casualty here we have like a bay area, so the curtains aren't going to stop those aerosols being thrown up into the air, whereas my hospital we actually have rooms, so the aerosol generated procedures can happen within the room, and just the staff going into that room need to wear this higher level of PPE. I could probably do like a 10-part Netflix documentary on PPE. And in fairness, Casualty does cover a lot of the more controversial areas, the fact that there were shortages early on, PPE being out of date, people having to buy their own stuff.
No time. Your blood pressure's a bit on the low side, but your oxygen saturation's normal. It should be safe for you to go home and self-isolate.
And when you say self-isolate?
It means you don't leave the house and you don't have contact with anyone else.
Okay, so the doctors assessed this young chap who's super fit, cycles a lot. We did develop a criteria for assessing these patients, whether they could safely be at home, and really that involved ruling anything else out, so anything else that could be causing breathlessness, and then looking at their basic observations, and perhaps most importantly, seeing if they're back to their baseline. Are they going to be safe at home? So I would have this chap mobilizing around this area, getting to exert himself a little bit, see how that changes his symptoms, how that changes his observations, and only then would you say this patient is fit to be discharged.
Anthony, can you hear me? Huh? Can I get some oxygen? Yeah.
Okay, so the patient has mobilized and has then collapsed. I saw a gentleman very similar to this situation, just a little bit older but fit and healthy. I thought he had more of a mild disease given the fact his symptoms he was talking about, and his observations were stable with me, but we did this test of having him walk around the room and seeing what happened, and he became extremely short of breath, real air hunger. Every step he took was like he was trying to climb Everest, and we got him to stop, and his SATs had gone from 97, 98 all the way down to mid 80s. So he's clearly going to need to stay in, have more of a workup, be observed, and have some supplementary oxygen too. So that's why it's so important to make sure people are back to baseline and make sure they're safe to go home. And even if we were to send them home, to make sure we give them very good safety net advice, what to look out for. The fact this dude here kind of just passes out like that is maybe a little bit unrealistic. This would hint at more of a blood pressure problem, which could also be caused by COVID-19. You'd expect people to come really, really short of breath, gasping for breath, before they just pass out like this. But I mean, as with all things in medicine, this wouldn't be impossible.
Even in my days as a cardiothoracic surgeon, I've not seen damage to lungs like this. And you're saying he managed to walk in by himself?
Wow, okay, so the chap that we saw earlier that's just passed out is now intubated on a ventilator. This is uncommon, but it did happen. People did deteriorate this quickly. In the emergency department, less likely, because we have a 4-hour target of which to refer patients on if we feel like they need to come into hospital. But I do remember distinctly young people again, that when they came with us had a small oxygen requirement, and then after a few hours needed to be intubated and go to ICU. So as sad as it is, this is just telling a very realistic story.
Yeah, well, I had a quick look into this, and it seems like silent hypoxia is emerging as a common feature of COVID. I don't think we can rely on SATs anymore.
No, right. Let's do a blood gas as a fail-safe.
Yeah, every time.
Okay, this is a really kind of advanced thing they're talking about here, the idea of silent hypoxia, or sometimes what we call happy hypoxia. This is the medical phenomenon where patients, how they feel, so their symptoms, do not tally with how low their oxygen levels are in the blood. This is not a new concept, it predated COVID-19, but would have been very uncommon. So the fact we're seeing it in COVID-19 kind of brings it to our forefront. So they're talking about here of taking an ABG, so an arterial blood gas. So that is where we take a blood sample from an artery, so it's deeper than a normal blood test, and that is when we'll find out really the degree of hypoxia, so how low the oxygen levels are in the blood. Although the way they describe it here is that we need to do an ABG on every patient that comes in with COVID-19. That is not true. We just wouldn't be able to do that. If patients come in and we've ruled out another cause of their breathlessness, their more of mild disease, their observations are fine, and they're moving around and they're still maintaining good oxygen sats, then they can be safely discharged. But we do need to give good safety net advice, when to seek medical attention. So no doubt the fact this chap was a cyclist meant he has been compensating for a long amount of time until his body is absolutely exhausted from breathing, and then suddenly he is unable to meet the oxygen demands of his body, and therefore we need to put him on a ventilator, a machine to breathe for him. So sadly, this young gentleman does not come off the ventilator. They withdraw support and he dies in ICU. It's worth noting here we'd be on the intensive care unit, so that really protected a lot of us emergency workers from seeing these outcomes, and really shifted that trauma and that difficult process onto our colleagues, so in the ICU and on to the medical wards, who would have just seen a horrendous number of people die. Obviously they're used to seeing patients die, but not necessarily as young patients, and nowhere near the frequency either.
I don't know what other option we have. She needs oxygen, but it's going to make her COPD worse and her CO2. Jade, stop. Jade, stop it.
This is a superbly done scene in terms of a really difficult scene. So discussing the ceiling of care. So, what treatments would we offer this patient? But it's also kind of the language and the way people are interacting with each other. We often see in medical dramas everything being kind of like a military operation, but the way we discuss things is much more like this. This is very realistic. Whenever someone comes into hospital acutely unwell, we need to make a decision on what treatments would be appropriate for them. A ventilator is not a magic machine. It's not like you put someone on, it breathes for them, and you jump back to life. It's extremely traumatic just going onto it. You need to be put to sleep. You need to be fed via a tube. You can't move, and so all your muscles end up deconditioning, and not only that, but you're getting all your muscles of breathing end up deconditioning too. So it's very difficult for people, if they're not at a good physical baseline, to come off a ventilator. And so this particular patient here, who's frail and has underlying lung disease, is just not appropriate to consider putting her on a ventilator.
Why?
Well, if she's arresting despite everything that we're doing, she's not going to be well enough to recover from ventilation.
What's he saying?
And then on top of that, you have the decision on whether resuscitation would be appropriate as well. Clearly this is not reversible, this COVID-19, on top of her lung disease as well. Just jumping on her chest and electric shocks to try and bring her heart back round would not be in her best interests. We try and have these conversations early on in the patient journey, with the patient, with the family. Practically, this isn't always possible as well. So if a patient comes in, acutely unwell and has a rapid decline, then there isn't time to discuss these things. So they have to be done at the bedside while this assessment is happening. So I would say this is more unusual, but it's not impossible for this to happen like this.
What stopped you from walking away?
A night shift where the case is slow. We had some food donated by the local pizza house.
Yes, this definitely happened, okay? So lots of food were donated from restaurants, cafes, just people at home, people sending in snacks. I know there's a Facebook group as well, lots of people hitting ambulances, so leaving treats and things. Sometimes our staff room looked like that scene from Hook.
I've spoken with him at length, and he understands that he can't be escalated for further treatment and has requested that we do not resuscitate.
Tonally, this has absolutely nailed it. Brings me back to lots of conversations I've had with family. We talked about difficult decisions we have to make when people come into hospital, involving the patients in those decisions and their family too. One thing I would say, the doctor becomes kind of very upset here, and you kind of build up a way of not taking it on board. Clearly you have to be empathetic, but the most important thing is to really listen to them and make sure you're communicating everything clearly and they're understanding things. But having said that, it can sometimes just totally hit you and you get a bit of a lump in your throat because, you know, you're really, you know, connect on a, you know, much more human level. What is less realistic is he's kind of doing it from an office here with this lovely background music. You know, in reality it's generally less tranquil than this. You know, you try and find an area that's a bit more quiet, but very often it's any available phone with everything buzzing around you.
Hey, you're back already.
I'm one of the lucky ones.
Well, it's great to see you back.
Oh, wow, I didn't... They've obviously done their research here, because this was an amazing feeling that I never really thought about, actually. When staff are off sick and they come back, particularly people that you know of more of an at-risk group, and yeah, this is exactly what it's like. So yeah, nice little addition, that scene.
Is there a ventilator up there with my name on it?
If it gets serious, then yes.
Okay, so one of the major storylines throughout this is the impact on staff in terms of staff getting sick, and we see here the receptionist has become critically ill. This highlights so many important things. So staff being exposed on the front line, but then staff having to treat their workers. I said earlier, what helps us is having a distance between patients and ourselves. It almost helps us do a better job, that we're not drawn in and have really difficult emotions to make the job harder. But when they're colleagues, that's unavoidable. And you can understand the fear that this gentleman has of going on a ventilator, knowing that the risks of mortality are around about 50%. And then the knock-on effect of having to talk to your colleague about that as well, and then your colleague knowing those kind of odds and having to be there. It's hard enough watching it on a drama, but then knowing that this would have happened thousands of times in the UK and around the world. We've seen a few staff that have become ill during this episode, but it's no accident that they picked the black receptionist here that becomes critically unwell, because this virus does discriminate. It's disproportionately affected people from the black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds. This clapping scene here, are they not wearing their mask properly? I know this happened on a few wards actually, when patients had a prolonged stay on the medical ward or ICU and they eventually were discharged. They'd get a standing ovation when they left. This wouldn't happen in the emergency department. People are not allowed to come back into the emergency department for obvious reasons. We don't want to spread infection round.
Noel's life support was turned off.
Extremely accurate and poignant scene. This is, you know, could pretty much have been a scene straight out of when one of our colleagues sadly died and we were brought together and given the news. There were also opportunities given throughout the following week to come together and express your thoughts.
We have been given the option to divert to St James's.
We've all just started a night shift.
The option to divert the ambulances, I mean, that may have happened elsewhere. That certainly didn't happen at my hospital. And like they were saying here, I don't think any of my colleagues would have accepted that. As soon as news like this was broken, a few minutes later, we were back on the ground doing our best for the next patient. This ending here, it's like they all come out the front of the hospital like the Avengers. We've just heard they've got a few ambulances coming in. They should be getting in the areas where they're going to be receiving the patients and checking the equipment, introducing themselves to everyone and getting ready to receive these trauma calls. But hey, I understand why they've done it. They're trying to produce this kind of epic shot to show that they're standing up despite everything that they've gone through. So there you have it, my thoughts on this brilliant episode of Casualty, dealing with some very moving moments, showing, you know, the real fight of the NHS. I thought it was a great testament to everything that's happened from what I've seen in the emergency department, and it was clearly created with a lot of love, and the research they did was absolutely brilliant. I know a few things I said could have been more realistic, but the reason why they make those changes are clearly for the story. If they wanted to make it 100% realistic, they no doubt could have done, but they're picking out the real, you know, the real deep and difficult moments, and which were certainly more uncommon, but bringing them to the forefront. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend checking it out. If you're in the UK, it's still on iPlayer at the moment. And also, hopefully this has given you more of an insight into what's been happening in my life over the last year. And it kind of leads on to, for me to say thank you so much for all the likes, all the comments, all the support on the channel, because when I have these, you know, some of these moments that have been shown here, to come back and read some of the lovely things you say and some of the real funny things you guys share, you know, it really does help get me through. So thank you for that. And so it just leaves me to say, I hope you're all well, and I'll see you soon.